We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. My speech coach, Kate Bennis, a wonderful communicator, often emphasizes that people don't remember facts. They remember stories. Unfortunately, energy companies offer a lot of facts to sell their importance. They spend a lot of time describing their technologies and how they work. Of course, this is important information that has to be conveyed, but it's not a story. It's not what will anchor your service or product or cause in the minds of those you want to reach, the corporate decision makers, the political leaders, the consumer. And finding your story is more important than ever, given the political headwinds working against clean power and distributed technology. So I brought together for today's discussion two people who think deeply and work regularly in this sphere. Jay Hodgkins, a specialist in the written word, is a freelance energy writer and an editor. And Scott Smith, a specialist in the spoken word, is president and chief podcasting officer at Penbury Consulting. They provide useful information about the art of storytelling for energy companies. Take a listen. Hey there, Jay and Scott. Thank you so much for being here today at the Energy Changemakers podcast.
Thank you, Elisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks, Lisa.
Usually we do these podcasts about energy issues. Maybe it's about some form of energy technology or new energy policy or new business modeling in the electric sector. But today we're doing something a little bit different. We often see those we work with in energy running into some really serious problems in terms of trying to communicate crucial messages. I really appreciate the two of you being on the show with me. You're two of my favorite communicators. Let's go ahead and dive in because I'm pretty excited to talk to you today. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I guess one of the first I want to ask is, we know effective communications is always important, but it seems to me maybe more so now. Do you think that's true? Let's start with Scott.
Yes, I absolutely do. I think especially with the energy industry, the impact of energy, we take it for granted many times. Is the power there, et cetera? And I think now it holds an even greater role as we watch things such as AI come online, take a greater role. To me, it feels a lot like my early days when I worked at Gartner, helping produce programs there where we were trying to explain the basics of technology to business people. And now we take that for granted. And I really think now it's learning how to explain these concepts in a way that everybody can grasp that makes it vital for anyone in the industry.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that lately. This is how old I am. I remember back when the personal computer was just coming into play. And people who would sell you computers would try to explain MS-DOS and all these things to you. And it was all very confusing. And I feel like that this is where the energy industry is now. We're just starting to have products that the consumer uses, like solar panels, like EVs, et cetera. And I guess sometimes we in energy are still speaking as though we're speaking to each other rather than to them. Jay, you and I work together a lot. Jay's an amazing writer, great at translating complex topics into things that the rest of us all understand, especially in the energy realm. Jay, how do you feel about this? Do you think that we're kind of at this pivotal point?
Yeah, at least I think you made some great points for the why communications is so important right now. But I have to say, I work with some really amazing communications professors at the Darden School at University of Virginia, and they would put my head on a platter if I didn't say effective communications have always been important. But I think what we're getting now in the energy industry is that more people understand, right? They're getting religion on the importance of communication. So it's not just the communicators saying, we need to improve our ability to communicate. Now you've got everyone from the C-suite on down who understands the importance because of the complexity in the industry.
So it's no longer kind of an add-on to their business. It's a more integral part of their business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get into some controversial stuff. Let's talk about politics. We actually don't talk about politics much in this podcast, but I think that's an important part of the communications discussion today. And I want to talk about renewables, first of all, because I think we're seeing a lot of miscommunication around renewable energy. This bothers me day and night because I'll pick up something on social media or in some publication and it'll be so wrong. How do we overcome this as an industry?
Yeah, Lisa, absolutely. It's become a personal issue for me too. My best friend here in Charlottesville is recently laid off by Ørsted, which is a Danish renewable developer. And it's specifically because of misinformation fueled resistance to offshore wind. It's really battered their business here in the United States. I just want to say this stuff matters. Jobs are at stake. The health of the economy is at stake. Ability to meet our demand for electricity in the United States is at stake. So that's a personal note, but it's a tough challenge, right? You asked the question, how do we fight the misinformation? I do have thoughts. I might be proven wrong, but I don't think this is something where you fight fire with fire, right? You fight fire with water. It might be old school, but I still believe in science-backed truth and facts. And the best way to douse the fire of misinformation is facts and data and evidence, because it doesn't really matter if it's about reliability or meeting energy demand or protecting the environment or creating jobs. The facts are on the side of renewables. And you're not going to win a communication battle against the Trump administration and social media trolls on X, right? So you need to focus that communication, those facts and the data on the people who matter. And I think those people are your local and state politicians, your state regulators, your chambers of commerce, your community leaders. First of all, there's fewer of them you have to convince. They have decision-making power. And they're influencers who can convince others for you. So you share the facts with them about job creation and economic impact and the need for reliability, et cetera, et cetera. And then those people are accountable to the truth, right? They're representing their communities. And I think that's the way to go about it.
So I should resist my desire to fire something off on Twitter and focus on the leaders. I think that's really good advice.
Sometimes it feels good to fire that post off on Twitter. We all know it.
I would have to agree completely there with what Jay said and take it a step further. And that is not just aiming it at those leaders, but putting it in ways that the average person can understand. So you have a groundswell behind you. Many times these political battles come down to people say, oh, I saw this. Yeah, I don't want to spend money on that. But what you have to do is craft stories. Let it know how it's going to impact them, the average person or the average company or whatever it is. So when you do come to them with these proposals and they say, why should I use this? Why should I care? Oh, that's what it's going to do for me. And I think that's one of the things that too often can get lost, that it stays at either a technical issue, a funding issue, or something that the average person can go over their heads. And when I say average person, I even mean that from company leaders or people who we would view as should know better or should know more. Let me phrase it that way. But too often it goes by them because they have so much on their plate that the simplest story, the simplest message is what grabs their attention.
I think that's great advice. I'm thinking about the Ørsted situation that Jay mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Off the coast of Rhode Island, Ørsted is building an offshore wind farm. And I'm sure you're also very familiar with this, Scott, because you're up in New England.
Yes.
And I think they were like 80 or 90% into construction, and it was stopped on, I think it was national security grounds.
Yes.
Temporarily, from what I understand. Ørsted did fight back and did win. But I think part of the winning was, I kept seeing this over and over again, was that it was made clear to folks in New England that this wind farm was going to help them get cheap energy. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's not where your politics stand on renewable energy. It's that the consumers in New England were going to get cheaper energy as a result of this wind farm. So it needed to go forward. So yeah, I think that's really what we need to get down to. How does it affect the average person? And it's hard to do because, especially in my business, sometimes I am called upon to speak directly to the consumer. Like I'll be hired to write blogs to educate people who are putting on solar panels. But a lot of times what I'm doing is I am writing for one side of the industry to speak to the other side of the industry. For example, perhaps a company that sells software for energy companies. They're speaking to the software engineers at the energy company. So it's not consumer driven. But I think even there, right, there are basic principles that apply. But Before we get into that, the principles and what people should be doing, let me ask you another question. And let me start with Scott, and then let's go over to Jay. Do you think that the energy industry needs to change its mindset about how it communicates? Is it used to thinking one way about how to communicate, and perhaps the times have changed and it needs to change with them?
Yes, I do. As I mentioned earlier, I see a lot of similarities to the changes I've seen in the information technology industry. I spent more than a quarter century at Gartner working on a variety of programs there. And we were working not only with our analysts, but with clients on how to communicate the benefits and the needs of technology that now we all take for granted. And I really think energy is in the same spot. And what I mean is that it used to be you were talking among each other. So using the kind of industry speak, using the technical terms, it was something everybody in the room would grasp. And now you really need to put it in terms that anybody can grasp and grasp right away. And I'm not just talking about speaking to the public or getting consumers on board. To the point you were just making, Elisa, I think it's even when you're talking to different companies within the industry, when you're doing B2B discussions, it's the person in that room who's making the decision might not have that same knowledge from a technical standpoint on the energy technology going in, but they need to be able to sell it up the chain. As Jay was mentioning earlier, as a leader might, on a municipal level, might need to sell it to their constituencies, to those approving the money. It's that same concept. And it really comes down to being able to frame it in the simplest language and in a story-like fashion, so everybody can grasp it and grasp it quickly. And that is a big sea change for anyone, especially when you're used to talking among a select group of people.
I love that you mentioned the word story. I have a speech coach, Kate Bennis, who's drilled into my head that people don't remember facts, they remember stories.
That's very true.
Yes.
Absolutely. That was one of the lessons I got. I began my life as a sports writer up in the wilds of New Hampshire and Vermont. And one of the first things I was given, here I'm a young buck out of a big city school, gone up to the middle of nowhere in my mind. And they come to me and they said, we want you to go cover a horseshoes tournament. And I'm thinking, horseshoes? Those things in the backyard? Who cares? And my boss was this local guy, very homespun. He just looked at me and said, nobody cares about horseshoes, but find a good story and everybody will grasp it and everybody will remember it. Just find the story. And it's the same here. If you start from a point where people can wrap their heads around it or find it interesting, they'll do that follow-up research or give you more time to explain the more technical side of things, the more advanced and detailed information.
Oh, that's such a good story. I think those of us who started in the local newspaper world, I did too, we really had to stretch that muscle because you sit through these really boring local board meetings or some crazy little local festival and you've got to come back and write a feature story about it.
Exactly.
Let me go over to Jay. What do you think? You are so in the thick of it in the energy industry. Do you think there's a mindset change that is required of the industry to really communicate better?
Yeah. When I thought about this, my mind started to drift to different sectors of the energy industry, right? There's a lot of different factions within the energy industry. And the one that stuck out the most, where the answer was yes, were utilities. Utilities, 100%. There's a mindset change that's happening and needs to continue to happen. Sometimes people like to beat on utilities for being conservative and stuck in their ways. It's a little unfair because their industry didn't really change for 100 years. So they really optimized doing everything the way that worked for 100 years, right? They learned to communicate in a way that worked within that system. But over the last 15 years, things you talked about earlier, Lisa, consumer choice, the energy transition, electrification of energy use. Now they realize they have this huge communication challenge with all of their different stakeholder groups, right? They have to communicate with their customers in a different way, their state regulators, environmental advocacy groups. The challenge has gotten a lot more complex for them, and they're making the transition. So I think they know their mindset needs to change and they're working on it. For others, Lisa, you mentioned the work that we do. A lot of times we're talking to technology providers and it's a lot of B2B, right? They're trying to sell other businesses on their product or service. I think the way they articulate their story can remain largely the same, but what they can do is continue to experiment with new tactics, new platforms to get the story to the right audience at the right time. And generally for everyone, I was laughing at the horseshoe story that Scott told. I also started as a small town newspaper journalist, and it just reminded me of the advice of every small town paper editor is find the slice of the pie. And that's something that energy communicators can use too, right? Find the slice of a pie in a story. A lot of times the big story, it's the same thing and it's easy for everyone to speak about it in the same way. So when you find the slice of the pie, that right slice, you can really get your message through.
That's a really good point. And the other thing is sometimes we forget that the electric power industry is a big, diverse industry. And you can have a room full of people in the industry who absolutely don't even speak the same language. And I mean technical language. For example, I used to host a microgrid conference. I've also been asked to speak about microgrids at a lot of different energy conferences, energy storage, solar, etc. Now, you would think, I'm standing in front of 200 or 300 people, you would think, given what they do, they would know what a microgrid is. But I can tell you that time and time again, I love to ask this question. If you were asked by your strictest high school teacher to define microgrid, do you feel you could do it? And you know, of those 200 or 300 people in the room, just a small portion would raise their hand yes. It always astounded me because I would get up in front of the crowd assuming they already knew what I was talking about. But this industry is changing so fast. There's so much new technology, so many new approaches that we have to realize that the person sitting next to us really might not know or understand what we do. I think that goes back to what you're both saying, that we need to think in simpler and more universal terms when we're speaking or writing.
That raises the great point of one of the mistakes we often make as an expert in any field is assuming everybody else knows what we're talking about. And even those who we would view as peers on the topic may not. And it could be something as simple as, look, again, I came out of Gartner. Acronyms were king. Everything seemed to have to be boiled down to 3 letters. But if I said a term like CRM, it could mean customer relationship management, content resource management. I couldn't assume somebody knew what I was talking about, and I found it easier to spell it out for everybody. And to your point, microgrid, quick description would be helpful rather than getting 20 minutes into a presentation and realizing the eyes are glazing over. Did they follow me down this route? And so it's just, again, recognizing even those who know the topic don't immediately grasp it. And human nature in many cases is not to stick up our hands and say, can you slow down and tell me what that means? Because we don't want to embarrass ourselves in front of a group. So we often remain quiet and say, I'll just look it up later.
Exactly. No one wants to be embarrassed. And you bring up another good point. Acronyms are the enemy.
Yes.
CRM, don't
Yes.
use it. Don't use it. It's a tough one. You know, I read about distributed energy resources, and the short word is DERS. And everybody in that industry calls them that, DERS, but nobody else does. So it's a tough one. Who am I speaking to? Can I use that acronym or not? And I would just suggest to people, go for or not as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yes.
At least I grew up in a military family. And so really, there can't be an industry in the world that's worse at using acronyms than the military. But energy tries to come close. You can have a conversation where people are talking about the ADMS and ETRM for their DER, and your eyes glaze over. And what are we talking about?
What's even worse is when you read a press release about energy written by the military. So let's talk a little bit about how you all spend your days, or rather, let's talk about how you spend your nights. What keeps you up at night? What communication issues are really hard for you to solve for this industry? Jay, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. My brain split that in two because there's one thing that's keeping me up at night. And then there's a separate list of things that are communication issues that are hard to resolve. If going back into politics a bit, what keeps me up at night right now is what I'm seeing with my clients, a real chilling effect the Trump administration is having on how energy companies are talking about sustainability. And I worry how that's going to ultimately hurt their brands and their relationships with customers as the pendulum likely swings back the other way one day. And what I mean is, from the start of this current administration, I had several clients come out with lists of basically do not say words and phrases. We're not going to communicate about this at all, spoken or written. And some sense, I get it. Every company adjusts to the current administration and political realities. That's good business. But there were things that were very core, like we can't mention climate change. We can't say net zero. And I'm looking at their websites and years of communication where that's really been a core part of their message. And I worry about the ramifications. That keeps me up at night. I don't know if it's ultimately going to hurt them or what'll happen, but it's keeping me up at night.
I totally agree with that one. It's been bothering me as well because it speaks to the integrity of the message. If we keep flipping back and forth. How can the customer trust what we're saying? So I understand their concerns. I understand where they stand. But boy, if you can stick to a message, one that you've been promoting for years, I think it's a better way to go. So Jay, let's go to the second part of that question now. What do you see as the communication issues that are hard to solve for this industry?
That one really split across sectors too. My mind first went to utilities, and it's an age-old question for them, a communication issue that's hard to solve. Why is my bill increasing? Why is my power going out more? For the technology vendors we work with, big thing for them is, how am I differentiated? Right? Like, why is my product or service or solution better than the 5 other options you could pick? They're trying to not be a commodity, and it's sometimes tough for them to differentiate themselves so they can be chosen on something other than price. For microgrid developers, Elisa, you can tell me if I'm wrong because you work so closely with this group, but I think what they're solving, that was one of their hardest communication issues for years, was, do I need a microgrid when I can just get cheap, reliable power from the grid? But now it seems like everyone sees the writing on the wall and microgrid use cases are exploding. So maybe everyone's catching up to them and that communication issue is really being solved for them.
I do think that's the case. I think because of AI in particular, I think there's a lot of concern out there that we're not going to have enough supply. And as a result, that's changed the microgrid proposition, because now it's, maybe I can get grid power, but I'm not going to be able to interconnect for several years. And my data center is going to be built before that. So suddenly a microgrid is the answer. So it has changed a bit. Scott, let's jump over to you now. You come from a different angle than Jay and I do. Jay and I are writers and editors, but you specialize in verbal communications. You're a podcast advisor. How do you think about this question? What is it that keeps you up at night when you're working with clients?
For me, it's getting them to realize the many different ways there are now to tell the story. I started as a writer, editor. At heart, I do consider myself such. And along the way, I've had this great opportunity to add a wide skill set, whether it's video, audio, etc. And yet at heart, it's the same thing. It's presenting that story, but taking advantage and realizing that channels are different and learning to adapt to them. Too often, for instance, if they come on to do a podcast, it can feel like someone's coming on and just reading a press release, or they're sounding like an infomercial because they haven't grasped that storytelling power of the medium. Or if it's a webinar, they're treating it almost like an audio program and it's just 2 talking heads rather than mixing in graphics or something of that sort. So when I sit down with the clients I work with, I'm really trying to get them to say, what is the message you're trying to get across? How can the different channels help you there? And do not treat them all the same. Treat them as a unified set of channels, but each one brings something different to the table. It really also goes back to something that Jay was saying, that now that when you have to pivot back and forth and that pendulum swings, too often the first reaction is, okay, it's not going to work anymore. Let's just toss out that whole story. Let's say nothing. And that's a mistake. There's always a way to tell it differently to get the point across. To what you were saying, Elisa, you remain consistent. It just might mean your wording or your approach has changed. And for me, it's really sitting with them and helping them to figure out, what is that approach and how do we take advantage of what's there without sounding like we're stuck in the past and just doing the same old thing in a new environment.
That's a good point. It's always a value in refreshing your messaging, right?
Yes.
Not just sticking to the same language, etc. But I want to jump back to something you mentioned, webinars. Mm-hmm. I have a real problem with webinars, and I would love to get your thoughts on it. I have said that I think webinars are the worst form of communication out there. Yet many of the companies we work with really like webinars.
Right.
I don't like webinars because they feel very unnatural to me. It's not the way people communicate. Usually it's a set of PowerPoints and one person speaks, the next person speaks. It's not a conversation. And then you start taking questions from the audience, which are totally disjointed. And one person wants to know when they're going to be able to download the slides. And the next person has a very deep technical engineering question. And I always feel like this is a very disjointed form of communication. I would love any advice you have on how to make webinars better. Any thoughts you have on them?
That could be an entire program in itself, but I'll be glad to try I did at Gartner. Besides leading the podcast there, I also became one of the lead moderators for our prospect-facing webinars, and certainly trying to find different ways to get that message out were key. One of the ones you talk about, I couldn't agree with you more on the dangers of the PowerPoint and the simple voice in PowerPoint webinar. It gets to be boring. You might as well have Ben Stein there going, Bueller, because all they're doing is reading their way down the screen, where I would often come away from programs saying, why don't you just send me the slides? I can read it in 10 minutes versus sitting here for an hour. But there are various ways to spice it up when you work with people, and I feel this way with podcasts. You mentioned about questions. Too often what happens is we treat it as, here come 55 minutes of slides and presentation, and we're going to leave 5 minutes of questions at the end. No, take advantage of your audience being right there. Ask for their questions along the way. Reference the questions. Use them so the audience feels they're a part of it. Throw in a poll or two. But also make sure you have help so someone is screening those questions. And we would often have the audience would type in the question, then have somebody read them out, or we could highlight them for the speaker and say, here's ones to take. So that solves the issue of the danger of potentially someone coming on unfiltered and giving a long-winded technical answer. So utilize that, get help, treat it like you would a live presentation in the sense of being in the room. You'd have someone to work the technology and so forth. The other thing is to vary it up. Have a little bit of a presentation up front and then veer into, I'd like to welcome my colleague to talk a little bit more in a panel setting, or to have more of a story back and forth, starting with a story rather than just jumping into PowerPoint. Here's a little video. Now let's discuss what you just saw. There's all different ways to utilize the medium, but too often we get stuck in utilizing the same old. And let me just make one more point, because it's my thing I came away hating at the end of my stint in the corporate world there. The term that became was fireside chat, whether it was for a podcast or whether it was for a webinar. We're going to have two people. And I would look and say, one, that's not what a fireside chat is. A fireside chat refers to Franklin Roosevelt putting the country at ease. Two, there's no fire. And three, nobody looks like they're chatting. It feels very stilted. So know what you're selling the audience, and then find a way to connect so the audience says, this is different. I'm finding this interesting. And it's very clear and easy to follow.
That's great advice. Okay. I'm feeling a little bit better about webinars now. Thank you.
And this is going to sound like a plug, but it's not. It's what I like to when I sit with companies and say, again, don't just think of the medium first. Think of what are you trying to do? And then let's figure out the best way to get that message out, because everything brings a different tone on that story. So too often they get enamored with, oh, my executive wants a podcast. Okay, but is that the best way to do it? My executives want webinars, but does your audience really want another PowerPoint? What is the best way? That's what they often fail. They don't put the story first. They try to push that square peg into the round hole to just because we need this. Not always.
So find the story and then figure out what medium is best to tell that story within.
The story, the message, to the point Jay was making earlier, if the discussion has changed in the way you have to talk about renewables, if suddenly renewable has become somehow a 4-letter word, okay, that's not going away. So how do we utilize this to illustrate for our audience that it's the same, but this is why it's so important to them? And that might not be a simple PowerPoint and someone presenting, which feels like something boring. Or it might not be two people sitting and talking, because that may not be the best way to frame it. What is going to get that message out there? What will resonate with your audience so they act upon your message?
I love that. That's just great advice. I think as a writer, one more thing I want to add in while we're on this kind of topic is when you're thinking about changing terminology, or even if you're just thinking about new terminology or a new product, be really careful how you name it. Because I think another thing I see this industry do a lot, and Jay, I suspect you'll agree with me, it comes up with odd names for things that an engineer perhaps will understand, or somebody within the industry will understand. You know, where one word would do, it's got 4 words. I think of at one point, there were some folks campaigning when I was at Microgrid Knowledge, they were campaigning to change the word microgrid. They didn't like it. They wanted to change it to non-wires alternatives. And that was such an insider term. Well, microgrid, You grasp what that is. It's a grid, but it's small. And I see that over and over again in this industry. It comes up with odd names. And that kind of leads me to my next question I want to ask the two of you. We have a lot of engineers in this industry, and I find it's often hard for engineers or people who specialize in a particular niche of energy to translate what they do. And I've been trying to lately get inside their heads, like, I am an engineer. Why am I speaking this way? Why is it hard for me to speak in a way that's more universal? I'm just curious what your thoughts might be on that. Jay, why is it often so hard for engineers and other energy specialists to translate what they do?
Yeah, great question. So often the engineers I work with, I think they get really concerned about their peers, what their peers will think about what they are reading that they said. So they want to be very technically precise, right? They worry that it's sort of a derogatory term. They're worried about dumbing things down for a more general audience because they think it's going to make it appear as if they're not really experts. But really, it's not dumbing it down. It's just effectively communicating to the people that you need to reach. Scott mentioned this earlier. Some of the people that they're trying to communicate with, they're quite smart. It might be a vice president for a data center developer. It might be the head of energy procurement for a university, but they're not versed in these heavy engineering issues in the way that you are. And so I would encourage them to worry a little bit less about their peer engineer reading and saying, oh, they didn't get this exactly technically precise. And instead saying, what is the correct level for me to communicate to the people that I need to take action? Once you go over people's heads with a lot of technical terms, a lot of acronyms, really bloated sentences because you're trying to capture every little nuance in a technical issue, people's eyes will glaze over. And in our current day and age, with our current attention spans and all the distractions we have, they're going to check out. They're not going to finish your message, and then you've accomplished nothing.
That's a really good point. I think it goes back to something that's often drummed into our heads as editors and writers and communicators is always be aware of your audience. In this case of the engineers, don't think about your peers. They're not your audience at this very moment. You're trying to communicate a product to people who are not engineers. So that's your audience. So I guess that's an important message. Scott, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll give you a strange analogy. I equate it to when you have that favorite band that was a hit on the alternative circuit, the college radio, and they produce that album that's taking them big time. And you get that segment of fans that are saying, you sold out. You're not the same. But guess what? Most of them do follow. Eventually, they get over themselves. And I must say, I had that reaction to one of my favorite bands of all time was REM, and they put out the album Green. It was like, oh no, they've gone pop or something. It's like, no, they're still making great music. Where was I? It's that same idea when we're communicating. We almost don't want to lose that college radio audience. In this case, it's our peers in the room. At the same time, to Jay's point, we are afraid as experts sometimes of sounding like we're too simplistic in front of our peers. And yet, I'll give you a great example, which is Alan Alda, the great actor. He was doing a PBS program, I believe it was Science, for several years. And what he came to realize was all these doctors and scientists had groundbreaking information that affected everybody. But when they put them before a regular audience, people got lost. And so he started a foundation, an institute that is designed to help these top-level scientists and medical experts to speak in average terms so people grasp the importance of what their research is and what their cures are, et cetera. So people then support their efforts for funding, for further research, et cetera. And he said they were reluctant at first, but as he worked with them, they began to realize, oh, it's not as difficult as I thought. Because the other thing, we just fear, oh, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone. And that's the other thing, too. You got to work with people ahead of time, say, no, you're not. We're just asking you to put it in simpler language, and we will work with you. We're not asking you to sing. We're not asking you to dance. You're not going to have to put on shadow puppets here to get people's attention. You're talking of what your expertise is, but just in a simpler way, less complicated.
And that's such a good point because the stakes are high now, right? Because our favorite band, Renewables, is getting smashed out there in the public. And I think the analogy is maybe breaking down on me here, but it's a really important point that you're making because at this point in history, if we want consumers to accept and embrace these changes that we're making in the energy system, they really do have to understand them.
There's a great example of where the power of story or the power of putting it through a particular lens can help grab the attention. and I say this as someone who's not in the energy industry, but comes at it from that storytelling standpoint. Too often I still hear people treat it in the public discourse as an either or. It's renewables, or it's fossil fuels, or it's the old way versus the new way, rather than blending it all together. And in reality, the story is, hey, as more and more power is needed to fuel our efforts in artificial intelligence or whatever the next great breakthrough is, we need ways to increase our energy output. And it's going to be renewables and what's already there. There's going to be a finite level of fossil fuels. So instead of us saying we're phasing them out, it's how can we augment them and be ready for when that transfer point is. But still, we're caught almost in a pendulum discussion. So it's how that message is presented that we can't fall victim to that old way of phrasing it, but saying, no, this is why it's going to impact you and your future, whether you're in the industry, whether you're someone who's served by the industry, or whether you just didn't realize that's what the power was needed, that AI is just not an additional application that goes on your computer, but rather it's going to need a whole bunch of more energy. And so you're going to hear these discussions about rate increases or about new infrastructure needed. This is why you need to pay attention.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's two worlds. There's the political world of energy and there is the physical world of energy.
Yeah.
And I keep hearing people say electrons aren't political, and that's what it comes down to.
Elisa, there's one other example I know you're familiar with. It's an issue that is highly technical, but it also has huge stakes for basically everyone's access to energy. And what I'm talking about is spinning reserves and inertia. And already I can hear people are like, oh gosh, what? But this is it. We talk to a lot of engineers, right? And they're highly concerned about how, let's go technical here. Let's pretend I'm an engineer. I'll probably butcher this, so apologies to the engineers. But we turn off our spinning power plants like natural gas generators, then all of a sudden we have less inertia on the system. And so we're going to have frequency and voltage fluctuations and reduced power quality. And it's, okay, that was a lot of technical stuff. What's going on here? Really, there's a story there that is a very important story that everyone can grasp. And that's, look, if we turn off that old power plant and we add a bunch of new renewables and we don't come up with a solution for it, then we're either going to fry your electric devices at home or we're going to have to cut off the power to avoid that. You probably don't want that, do you? Okay, we've got a solution. We can add some batteries in some strategic places and we can solve that problem. It's a much easier story that doesn't have to go into the technical details, and anyone can grasp that at any level.
Oh my God, I just want to take that clip right there and just play it over and over again everywhere. Thank you. That's great. Okay, so let me ask you, you've both been in the field for a long time, in communications field for a long time, Jay in energy and Scott in all kinds of things. Has it become harder or easier to work in energy or any kind of technical communications in recent years? Scott, why don't you start?
I'm going to say both. And the reason is not to equivocate here, but rather it's easier in the sense there are more ways to get your message out. We now don't have to rely strictly on the spoken word. If you're someone who feels uncomfortable, you can bring visuals. You can utilize different media to get that word out. And I mean, is whether it's written, whether it's audio, whether it's video. At the same time, it's harder because you have to be better at communicating and figuring out what's that best way to present the story. Who is my audience? Because more people have access to you. It used to be just if you were an expert, you'd walk into a room where the client you were trying to please or whatever, and you had a small audience. Now it could be anybody tuning into a YouTube video, tuning into a webinar online, tuning into a podcast, and you want to be remembered for that message rather than, there was this guy, I'm sure he's very smart, but I have no clue what they just said. And so you feel more pressure in that regard. And one of the things I find from people, I must say, is they say, well, I don't know, I'm just not really good at it. I'm not someone who speaks well online or writes well or whatever. And it's no, but you're the expert. So let's figure out how to get that message out of you so we don't lose your expertise. And it's not just having the same talking heads on over and over because they speak well, but they can't answer those in-depth questions because they don't have your level of knowledge.
Oh, that is such a good point. And it's such a horror for folks like me every day because I do write for a specific audience, specific energy audience, but on the web, anybody can pick it up, like you said, YouTube, anywhere. I mean, they just pick things up. And I will get emails from some homeowner in North Dakota who says, oh, I think I like this idea of a microgrid. I want to do it. Can you tell me something about it? So you're writing about it. And it's, wow, I didn't mean to reach this person, but I guess I did. So it makes it hard. It makes it very hard. I know when I sit down to write, sometimes I think to myself, okay, I know I'm writing for a specific audience, but other people are going to read this. Is there a way I can somehow encompass them? So it's very tricky. Jay, what do you think? Are you finding it harder or easier to work in energy communications?
Well, I'm so glad Scott went first on this one and gave me permission to also say both. So I think it is not a cop-out, but it's easier because of something I mentioned earlier. And I think more energy companies have come around to the reality that they have to communicate, that it's really important. There's that buy-in. When I started in the industry in the latter half of the 2000s, a lot of companies saw no real reason to communicate. It's like, let's do the bare minimum with our shareholders. We'll put out a press release every once in a while. That mentality's gone, and I find that very refreshing. They want to communicate because they want everyone to understand the complexity and the change they're facing and justify the actions they need to take. But it's harder for that same reason of complexity. Technology in the energy space is a wonderful thing. It's driving innovation. It's creating all these new wonderful possibilities, but it's made the story more complex. There are a lot of subplots spinning around. The big plot is still, as it has always been, safe, reliable, affordable electricity, but there's so many more subplots underneath that. So it's hard to articulate what really matters, why one issue or solution is more relevant than others, but it is an incredible opportunity for companies to use storytelling to carve out a niche. So I've seen this with now smaller, innovative companies are getting a foothold where you used to have to be like a big multinational conglomerate. And I really think it's not just their technology, but it's their storytelling that allows them to articulate, we can help you in this specific way because of this new technology.
Elisa, it goes back to something you had said earlier, where you often deal with companies who are not directly reaching out to the consumer, let's say. And I think this is the chance. The difference now is showing the interconnectivity of all the different facets of the energy industry. In other words, the average person, the average company just thinks about the delivery of power to them, the delivery of energy to them. And it's now so much more. It's the software, it's the infrastructure, it's all those different elements. And we need to show why they're interconnected, even if they're not directly buying from us or directly interacting with us. Everything is like a domino effect. If this isn't taken care of, it is going to impact you someday. You may not think wind is an important issue if you're living pick somewhere in the middle of the country. I know on the plains, it's a big deal. But you may be looking at something off the coast of Rhode Island and saying, I don't live along the ocean. But again, it's about the entire grid, the entire infrastructure. And that's the message that has to get out from all facets of energy, is that everything impacts everybody in the end.
So true. I'm going to put the two of you on the spot now, and I'm going to ask if you had to give 3 simple pieces of communications advice to a subject matter expert, what would they be? Do you want to continue, Scott?
Sure. 3, I would go in and say, be clear, be yourself, be honest. That is simply speak in plain language, get away from your acronyms, and remember you want to reach everybody in the room, not just those who know the inside baseball stuff. You be yourself. I think too often we freeze up and we think, no, I've got to sound perfect. I've got to sound polished when we present something. Don't. In today's day and age, people expect imperfections. And in fact, they make you sound more authentic rather than, oh, they were handed a script. It sounds like an infomercial. The other thing is be honest. Just tell people the truth. Don't leave them with saying, you just sound like you're giving me a bunch of industry speak or you're just giving me the party line. I don't mean that in a political sense, but I just mean from a company standpoint. And so just trust them. Don't insult them and just tell them straight up. These are the facts. This is what's going on. This is what it will cost. Whatever what might be perceived as, say, controversial, they'll appreciate having that information.
I love all of that. I especially love the part about not being worried about the imperfections. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think that is soon going to become more of a virtue because you look at AI and how it smooths everything over to this just unblemished or writing. It feels very unreal. Humans don't communicate that way. So I think that the imperfection of humanness is probably going to become a real virtue as we just get really tired of seeing all of this AI content that's out there. Jay, what are your thoughts? What 3 simple pieces of communications advice would you give?
Yeah. The first one I have to say is a message to myself, in addition to every other communicator and company out there. I have to remind myself of this every day, every time my fingers touch a keyboard, and that is keep it short. No one has the time and your audience doesn't care as much as you care. So keep it short. The second is your customer is the hero. So many times people get so invested in what they do. They're so passionate about what they do that they make it about them. You're not the hero. Your customer is the hero. Show how you help them along their hero's journey, right? The story is about them and their hero's journey. And then lastly, I'd say make sure that you can very carefully articulate what makes you different and how that benefits your customer. So the odds are you have competitors and they're communicating about the same challenges and they can list the same general benefits that you can. So what really makes you different? Think about that hard and come up with a strong answer.
This is why I like to work with you so much, Jay. Brilliant. I have to thank the both of you. This has been so interesting, and I feel like I have learned so much from listening to the two of you, and I am going to be thinking about this discussion a lot over the next few days, I'm sure, or longer. So thank you. Thank you very much for being here today.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.